So logical fallacies are flaws in reasoning that lead to faulty, illogical statements. They are unreasonable, argumentative name for what has gone wrong during the reasoning process. Most logical fallacies masquerade as reasonable statements, but they are in fact attempts to manipulate readers by reaching their emotions instead of their intellects. So just a really quick review of what we've been talking about the last few weeks. Deductive arguments are valid and are sound if the premises are true, and all inductive arguments are technically invalid, and the terms most often used to distinguish between good and bad inductive arguments are strong and weak. An example of a strong inductive argument would be, every day to date, the law of gravity has held, therefore, the law of gravity will hold tomorrow. That's taking a generalization to the specific. Arguments that fail to meet the standards required of inductive arguments commit fallacies. It is these informal fallacies that is of most concern. Distinguishing between strong and weak arguments. A strong argument is a view that is supported by solid facts and reasoning, while a weak argument follows from poor reasoning and inaccurate information. Strong arguments must be supported by reputable sources, or they risk being invalidated by others. Weak arguments contain problems with the logic used to support them. And as we've been doing throughout this whole course, arguments consist of premises, inferences, and conclusion. So we'll be examining preferences, inferences, and conclusions. So let me start off discussing the many different types of logical fallacies. The fallacies of relevance clearly fail to provide adequate reason for believing the truth of their conclusion. They are often used in attempts to persuade people by non-logical means. Only the unwary, the predisposed, and the gullible are apt to be fooled by their illegitimate appeals. Many of them were identified by medieval and Renaissance logicians, and hence many of these logical fallacies will have Latin names attached to them. So essentially, the argumentative style in logical fallacies is, essentially the argumentative style is not relevant. One type of argument is called an ad hominem argument. Hominem is Latin for the man, and essentially it's an argument that goes against the person, not the argument itself. It directly attacks someone's appearance, personal habits, or character, rather than focusing on the merit of the issue at hand. The implication is that if something is wrong, the person, then whatever he says must be wrong. So, an example, how can you say that Muhammad's position on abortion is true when he's been in and out of drug rehab for 3 years? So that's attacking the person, not the argument. So here's another example. Sarah is divorced, so whatever relationship advice she gives you cannot be good. Sarah's marital status has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of her advice. It's also possible that Sarah could be married and give awful advice. Nora?
I'm just how this is policy, like, is it always applies because like sometimes it's kind of making sense.
I mean, now you're totally deflecting the whole argument from the argument itself to the person. Now, you could say the argument is false because it's, and we'll talk about this in a few seconds, that he's not an authority.
Okay.
But be that as it may, if it's good advice, he doesn't have to be an authority. I mean, who knows where he got his information from, but you have to consider many things in trying to assess the strength of the argument. The person who is saying it, I do agree. So at first you may have some doubts, but then if it's other things to consider about the argument, I mean, there's many different things. The person who's saying it, whether it makes common sense, right? That's another way to evaluate an argument. So again, I agree with you. It doesn't seem like this person is an authority, but if it makes common sense, then it's a strong argument. Okay. Other people have their hands raised. Thanks for raising that question. Okay. All right. Yes.
I would say maybe that fat man is a nutritionist. So it's not about the man, it's about what he is saying.
I will not take his advice.
This is your business.
Maybe what he's saying is true. I agree. Maybe he's having a point, and maybe his point is valid, and maybe he is saying something correct. But I will not be convinced. And it's not making me feel a strong argument.
It is wrong, strong argument, but you are not convinced by the man. You are still confused between the man and argument.
What about this? Let's say a doctor who smokes cigarettes tells his patient, you should not smoke.
It's same.
It's not a good example. He's not good example, but
the argument is strong. That fat man was a nutritionist, so.
Well, it's the same thing as the physician who smokes cigarettes and tells you not to smoke. Well, he's making, and then he tells you why, blah, 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 and it makes sense. And just because the doctor doesn't follow his or her own example doesn't necessarily make the argument weak.
Okay.
All right, good. Let's move on. Right. So here's another example. Sorry. Right, so here we have people who say that hazing in the military is wrong, are just a bunch of wimps. He's a liar, so there's no reason to listen to him. Okay. Now, that may or may not be true, but just saying you shouldn't listen to him because he's a liar is not the way to refute the argument. Okay. So inappropriate appeal to authority. This is kind of like the opposite of what we've just been talking about. This fallacy occurs when an arguer cites an authority there is good reason to believe is unreliable. So you can't say follow that advice because he's an authority on the subject when he really or she really is not. So the implication is that if someone is an expert, then whatever he or she says must be correct, regardless of the subject matter. So when the source examples, when the source cited is not a genuine authority on the subject under consideration, and we talked about judging sources the last time we met, or when there's reason to believe that the source is biased, when the accuracy of the source observations is questionable from common sense, when the source cited is known to be generally unreliable, or when the source has not been cited correctly, or the cited claim has been taken out of context, when the source claims conflicts with expert consensus or other experts. So inappropriate appeal to authority. For example, most immigrants who enter this country wind up in jail or on welfare. I know this because I read it on the White Power Worldwide website. Why is this an inappropriate appeal to authority? Well, we know this website is known to be generally unreliable. Dr. Stanford Higginbotham, a leading social philosopher, has argued that capital punishment is always morally wrong. Given Dr. Higginbotham's impressive credentials, we should conclude that capital punishment is always wrong. Well, the source's claim cannot be settled by an appeal to expert opinion. I mean, essentially, there's no expert consensus that exists. Now, Higginbotham could be a philosopher, blah, 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 but we know that there isn't a consensus that capital punishment is always morally wrong. So just because he's actually is an authority on one subject matter, like moral philosophy, doesn't mean everything he says is correct. Circumstantial ad hominem. This is where the arguer suggests that her opponent's view is false to gain if it is accepted. So, for example, Of course, France opposed the war on Iraq. They got millions of dollars of contracts at stake. Or we should disregard the scientists' argument because they are being funded by the logging industry. Now, you may have reason to suspect the scientists being biased, but you can't totally refute the argument just because he's being funded by the logging industry. So, like, another example is a drug regulatory body wants advice on whether a drug should be funded. So they get a panel of experts. And it just so happens to be that almost everyone on the panel is being funded by the drug company. So one could say that we can't take their advice. Well, in that case, and this happens a lot, especially in the US, where a lot of doctors are being funded by the drug company. Well, the alternative is to get other people, other doctors who are not experts on the drug at hand. And essentially, even though the other panel of experts were, seems like they could be biased, but you know they're biased, and that gives you consider their opinion. So just because they're being funded, they could be biased, but that doesn't give you a reason to totally reject the argument, if that makes sense. And ad hominem, you too. So essentially, the arguer suggests that her opponent's position is inconsistent with their own beliefs or actions, and therefore the position is false. So, an example, you're telling me to stop speeding on the highway? You received more speeding tickets than I have. Gore, or Al Gore, is a hypocrite on campaign finance issues. He's raised as much money as anyone. You say I shouldn't drink, but you haven't been sober for more than a year. So this is actually similar to the fat guy. You say I shouldn't eat fatty food, but you're fat yourself, okay? So again, this is the example that you're not refuting the argument itself, you're just referring to the person at hand. Now, red herring or smoke screen, that's when the arguer changes the subject and take the listener down a different, unrelated path. So environmentalists are continually harping about the dangers of nuclear power. That's the argument. And you're trying to refute it. Unfortunately, electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. Oh, I'm sorry. The arguer is saying, unfortunately, electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. Every year, hundreds of people are electrocuted by accidents. Since most of the accidents are caused by carelessness, they could be avoided if people would just exercise greater caution. That has nothing to do with power. Another example. In order to really look at the problem of global warming, we must first consider how the homeless suffer when it is cold. Well, it may be true that the homeless people suffer when it's cold, but that doesn't support the argument about global warming. The arguer has taken you down a totally different pathway. Guilt by association. The arguer suggests her opponent's views should be rejected because the opponent is a member of a perceived disreputable group, or the views of the opponent are also held by persons of a disreputable group. So, for example, nationalized healthcare programs are unacceptable because they're the sort of thing that communists support. There's no reason to deal with Arafat. He's a known terrorist. Politician X once spoke with the leader of the KKK. Well, who cares? If he spoke with the leader of the KKK, that has nothing to do with the strength of the person's argument. Ad populum fallacy, or jumping on the bandwagon. The arguer appeals to the sheer number of persons who agree with the belief, or to the popularity of the belief as evidence that it is true. For example, because a majority of Americans believe in UFOs, they must exist. That many people can't be wrong. Or 4 out of 5 dentists recommend brushing pure sugar. Well, this argument is trying to prove itself by showing that many dentists believe it's correct. Well, we know it's not correct, but the person is trying to show that just because the sheer number of people who believe in that belief, then the argument must be true. Force or fear. The arguer tries to get you to accept their view on the grounds that you will be harmed if you don't accept their views. They use the attempt to motivate you from fear rather than logically persuade you. So, for example, so you're an animal rights activist. I would consider changing my views if I were you, because most of us here on the prairies are beef farmers, and we don't care too much for your kind. This appeals to force or fear is somewhat so similar to a slippery slope argument that we'll discuss in just a few minutes. Appeals to emotion. You try to manipulate an emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument. And we talked about using loaded language to get someone to accept your argument. Appeals to emotion includes appeals to fear, envy, hatred, pity, pride, and more. So essentially, the fallacy occurs when emotion is used instead of a logical argument. And here's a list of negative emotions and positive emotions. So, for example, Greta to the United Nations. Greta is a climate, if you may, activist. And she says, how dare you? Or the starving, he's starving, we're not. It's time to share. And other types of ad, a real estate ad that shows a happy young family with children moving into the home of their dreams, a politician who argues that the other party is going to cut spending, and that will have a negative impact on grandmothers living on Social Security, or a political ad that shows the candidate shaking hands with the community church on Sunday morning. Here's another common fallacy: appeals to tradition. The arguer bases the acceptance of a position on the mere fact that they've always believed it, or that it has always been accepted in society. So, for example, although horrendous in our eyes, the burning of the wives of deceased men should be considered morally acceptable, since the society in question has been doing it for centuries. Or gay marriage is wrong because marriage has always been between a man and a woman. Essentially, let me write this down. We say in philosophy that an is not an ought. What do I mean by that? An is not an ought.
I think an is a fact, but maybe an ought is just a belief.
Okay, other thoughts?
Maybe it's not like it's not a must to do. Like I have the option to do it or not.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
That if something exists does not mean that it has to be like it has to be existed.
Right, that's right. And is refers to the way things are usually done. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we ought to do it. If that's the case, we would never make any moral progress. And so think of all the things that have occurred in previous years, and well, and with change. For whatever reason, we realized that the previous practice was actually wrong. And I could take an example from US history, the issue of slavery, and also another example, for the longest time, women could not vote for whatever reason. Finally, they got the right to vote in 1918. So another example, women should change their names when they marry. That's the way it's always been done. Okay. Another type of fallacy is called post hoc, short for post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore caused by this. So this fallacy assumes just because B happened after A, it must have been caused by A. And this is a popular argument made by politicians. So, for example, when Governor Bush took office, unemployment of minorities in his state decreased by 7%. Hence, Governor Bush should be applauded for reducing among minorities. But before he pat the governor on his back, the speaker must show that Bush's policies are responsible for the decrease in unemployment. It is not enough to show the decrease came after his election. So, hasty generalization, that occurs when a conclusion is based on insufficient or unrepresentative evidence. For example, the only redheads I know are rude, therefore all redheads must have bad manners. So, and I think we discussed this before, if the speaker only knows two redheads, like the person who watches only two Nicole Kidman's movie, then he has, if he only knows two redheads, then he has insufficient evidence to make the general claim about all people with that hair color. Now, with the Nicole Kidman example, the speaker said probably. So that doesn't make it all that grievous of a statement. So more on generalization. For example, 75% of the people who responded to our poll via email have some college education. So 75% of all Americans have some college education. Essentially, in the early days of polling, people used to poll people, well, here it is by email. Well, does everybody have access to email? Well, it seems like today they do, but 10 years ago, the answer was no. And only people, let's say, who had a college education or had access to computers will respond to a poll via email. Another example, you can't speak French. I can, hence no one at the University of Arizona Analogy, and we discussed this in depth at our last sessions. Essentially, an analogy tries to prove its point by pointing out similarities that are not relevant. A false analogy claims comparison when differences outweigh the similarities. So usually, as we saw, most of the times, or many times, the arguer will only mention the similarities, but you have to think about the differences that may outweigh the similarities. So, for example, in that previous controversial example we discussed the last time, Saddam is like Hitler, and therefore we should take him out. But that would be an example of just pointing out similarities, but actually the differences between the two may probably outweigh the similarities. Another example, if we could put a man on the moon, why can't we find the cure for the common cold? Well, both things are being compared here are related to science. However, there are more differences than similarities between space and biological advancements. So just because we had the scientific ability to put a man on the moon, that doesn't mean we could also find the cure for the common cold, because we're talking really about two different things. A straw man. The arguer makes her own position appear stronger by misrepresenting her opponent's position as being a weak argument or incredible. So, for example, Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for this country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. So essentially, which statement represents the weak argument? And is this really what Goldberg was arguing? Certainly not. So essentially, you're trying to argue against Mr. Goldberg by creating a straw man by saying he advocates atheism. And attacking atheism is much easier than attacking any other argument against prayer. So the straw man, think of the straw man as something made out of a straw, could be easily attacked. More examples. A student tells his professor that he thinks some of Donald Trump's position have merit. And the professor says he can't believe that the student believes in supporting racism. So supporting racism is the straw man. And hence the professor is refuting the student's argument by creating a straw man. Another example. Senator Smith says that the nation should not add to the defense budget. Senator Jones says that he can't believe that Senator Smith wants to leave the nation defenseless. So again, the straw man argument is leaving the nation defenseless. So that's not the way to argue against Senator Smith.
Professor, can you just give another example or maybe clarify more about the straw man? I didn't understand it.
Okay, here it is. Here's the other. I anticipated you wanted another example. So here's the other example. And the student says, and given my contributions to this paper, I think that I deserve to share. If you want to refute this argument of the student, what could the professor say? If the professor doesn't think that the student made contributions to the paper, what would be a good argument against giving the student credit with the first author?
Do you mean like when somebody is already perceiving something that is not correct?
Well, the student, I'll give you a person's example. I had a resident, we did some research, and after I wrote it up, I left his name off the authorship list. And the student came to me and complained, saying, I think I deserve to be an author.
Okay.
So I need to back up my argument and with strong claims that cannot be refuted. Okay. And so I essentially told the resident, essentially, you didn't contribute to the idea of the research, you didn't collect any data, and you didn't contribute to the writing of the paper. Instead of that, so fame is more important to you than science. So would you be able to attack that argument? And the professor is misrepresenting the student's argument. And now the professor is able to refute the student's argument by saying that fame is more important. And essentially, the fame premise is the straw man. And so the professor is misrepresenting the argument in order to refute the student's claim.
It's kind of difficult.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to. It's kind of difficult to argue because some people are already using this the fallacy.
What do you mean? Tell me more.
يعني when I argue with some people, they're already they don't want to, for example, change, or they don't want to think about other thoughts. Maybe they are kind of close-minded. So, like for example, if like something come up with some subject that it is not usually they know about it, so they tend to um, um, take the bad idea about it or replace it by false idea.
Okay, and hence,
Maybe like pivoting what I'm saying to their
I'm
side.
sorry?
Like pivoting, that's the word. Like taking the what I'm saying and modify it so it will suit their own.
Well, they modify it, and by modifying, you're creating a straw man. So in this case, in this cartoon, the professor is saying, oh, so fame is more important. So it's easier to refute a premise about fame. Fame is not a way to claim that you should be an author. But the student didn't say that. The professor said that. And so the professor is misrepresenting the student's claim. The professor could not argue against the student because maybe the student did make strong contributions. So the professor is now making up another premise that's easily refutable. So fame is more important.
So is this like misunderstanding is intentional or not intentional?
Well, no, it is intentional. So if I want to refute your argument, I would represent your statement with a statement that's easier to refute. Let me.
So the defense will be to destruct this link. Moving from real contribution means I need to be listed as an author. He linked this premise or developed it into, no, you want fame. So if I can destroy the link that the professor made, I can respond to the professor.
Oh, no. The professor, you're close. The professor wants to refute the student's argument by claiming, the professor is claiming that the student is interested in fame. So if a student says, I deserve to be an author because fame is very important to me. Is that a strong argument? To be an author?
No.
No. But the student didn't say that. The professor is misrepresenting the student's argument by substituting a weak premise. Maybe that makes it easier to understand. A weak premise is like a straw man. It's easily attacked. But the student never said that. But the professor is misrepresenting the claim of the student by bringing up a weak premise that he could attack. See, the student in the next frame says, what? I didn't say that. And so I didn't say fame is more important. I still have a strong argument. You can't refute my argument by saying you can't say I meant fame is important. That's misrepresenting my claim by putting in a weak premise that I never said.
How to defeat this fallacy? Like if we've ever encounter someone who is intentionally or sometimes not intentionally.
What the student say in the second frame? Hey, wait a second. I didn't say that. Okay? I didn't say anything about fame. You're redirecting my argument, and hence I want to claim to be an author because I helped with the development of the idea. I collected data and I contribute to the writing of the paper. So it could be the professor is talking with his colleagues about whether the student should be an author. And the professor says, oh, this student should not be an author because he thinks fame is more important. That's not a reason. So the professor is saying the student is making the argument that fame is more important. But he never said that, but be that as it may, because the professor added a weak premise, now he could attack the student. He couldn't attack the student before because the student made a good argument and the present this adding a weak premise, and now the professor could refute the claim by substituting a weak premise that the student never said. We have a few examples in our exercises, and maybe that will make it clearer. Let me just finish up with some more examples, and because I want to get to the exercise, which will make things clearer. I hope. A false dilemma asserts that a complex situation can have only two possible outcomes, and that one of the options is necessary or preferable. Either go to college or forget about making money. This falsely implies that a college education is a prerequisite for financial success. So essentially, it's a false dilemma or only presenting two alternatives. Or another example, either we ban negative ads or we let them run amok on our television situation. So it's bringing up only two alternatives. If guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Well, there's more alternatives than that. So it's not a dilemma, it's a false dilemma because there's other alternatives. it's not necessarily true that outlaws will have guns. Or this is also commonly used with raising children. Okay, you tell your child, you either eat dinner or the boogeyman will come after you tonight. Okay, obviously that's not true. Let me skip this. Slippery slope. This is so common, so common. Essentially, the arguer claims that if a certain seemingly harmless action like A is permitted, then A will lead to B, B leads to C, and so on to D. And therefore A should not be permitted. Well, there is no good reason to believe that A will actually lead to D. The arguer is bringing up this scenario that if you legalize A, then D will happen. And D is a bad thing, and hence it's trying to induce fear. So, example, marijuana is a gateway drug. All heroin addicts started by smoking pot. So essentially, if you do A, smoking marijuana, you're gonna become a heroin addict. So again, that's a way to convince people not to legalize marijuana. Slippery slope. Well, yeah, Newt Gingrich, who used to be a senator in the US, says we must vigorously oppose any legalization of same-sex marriage. Once we allow same-sex couples to marry, next we will be permitting marriages among 3 or more people. Next, we will allow people to marry their dogs, cats, and boa constrictors. Finally, people will want to marry their iPhones. Okay, so again, essentially, it will be tragic if this country ever legalizes gay marriage. Mark my words, once that happens, it won't be long until polygamy and incest are legal, right? So polygamy and incest are considered not good things, and is trying to argue against gay marriage by saying gay marriage will lead to all these terrible things. But there's no evidence that that will happen whatsoever.
So what if there is an evidence?
Well, if there is evidence, it's not a slippery slope.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, essentially, instead of using evidence, it's bringing up the. So again, how you evaluate the strength of an argument is, well, you want the evidence. So in order to refute a slippery slope, you say, where's the evidence for that? I think
for example, we can say that the same-sex marriage were legalized in, for example, in this country, and that lead to requesting or some people demanding marrying dogs and their cats.
Right. So
By
I think
example,
I gave an example last time when I said we had this conference about a patient, and the attending kept on saying, if we send her to a long-term care facility, she'll just leave. And I said, what's the probability of that? We don't know that. The attending said, well, she keeps on saying she wants to leave the hospital. And I said, well, has she ever left the hospital? And the answer was no, because she was wheelchair bound. So I essentially, so how do you know she's going to leave the hospital? That's the slippery slope. Poisoning the well, the arguer uses biased language to support their views rather than offering evidence. So we should support the Haiti because they are a backward nation and thus require guidance from a progressive country like ours. Okay, so actually, this happened with the, what I'm trying to say, when the missionaries went to Africa, they wanted to instill Christianity on the Africans. And they said, the Africans are backward people. So using biased language. That has happened so often in history.
Professor, is it possible that somebody is combining two fallacies together? Yani, for example, saying if we legalize homosexuality, maybe it will lead to legalizing the pedophilia.
Well, that's the slippery slope.
Yes, and then like maybe saying, do you wish for your children to live in this environment, or you don't feel afraid for your children?
Well, that's still the slippery slope. That's not poisoning the well.
But this is like combination of slippery slope and then something else.
Well, I say your argument again.
Legalizing same-sex marriage will lead to legalizing pedophilia and a pedophile marriage or something like that. And then it is not safe for your children to grow in this environment.
Well, that's mainly a slippery slope. Once you use the word lead, that's the slippery slope.
Okay.
Poisoning the well is you're not envisioning a slope that's slippery. You're not saying A will lead to D. Poisoning the well says, we must do this because the people are bad people. That's totally different from slippery slope. Here's poisoning the well. Well, this is positive language. Instead of saying we treat, we say strategic withdrawal. Instead of saying the bombs cause dead innocent civilians, well, we have collateral damage. So this is the opposite of poisoning the well. You're using positive language instead of negative. Genetic fallacy occurs when a claim is accepted as true or false based on the origin of the claim instead of looking at the actual merits of the claim. Okay. My parents told me that God exists, therefore God exists. So it's looking at the origin of the claim. My sixth grade teacher, Mr. Harris, said that all women are bad drivers, so it must be true. Another example is the media claims that the senator was taking bribes, but we all know about the media's credibility, right? So a genetic fallacy also occurs when one tries to discredit the source or origin of an argument. So it works both ways. You either support your argument by discrediting the source, or you support your argument by claiming the source is good. So that's like a genetic fallacy because you're looking at the origin of the claim. It's something like a false authority. Shifting the burden of proof, asserting that a claim is true because it cannot be proven false. So the burden lies with someone else to disprove it. So for example, Prof, you added your buddies as co-authors on my paper. Well, you can't prove that they didn't contribute to it. I can't prove that they didn't contribute either. Now you're just talking crazy. So, I mean, essentially, we say in criminal trials, the burden of proof is on the prosecutor if he wants to claim that this person is guilty. Well, and you say, well, you can't put him to jail because you can't prove that they didn't do it. Well, I'm not trying to prove that they didn't do it. I'm trying to prove that so I can't prove that they didn't do it. I could only prove that they did do it. Begging the question, it's kind of like a circular argument where the strength of the premise is dependent on the truth of the conclusion. So wrestling is dangerous because it's unsafe. So the premise, it's unsafe, is totally based on the conclusion. Jogging is fun because it is enjoyable. Well, that's just restating the conclusion, which is begging the question. Another example, let me do this one. Here on the right-hand side. Can you explain what you mean when you say Aladdin is your hero? Of course. I mean, he acts heroically, which means what to you? So why is Aladdin your hero? Well, he acts heroically. It's stating the same thing. The premise and the conclusion is essentially the strength of the premise depends It's actually restating the conclusion. So it still begs the question.